Thank you all for joining us to a session on building audience for your paper with Professor Joel Migdal from University of Washington leading the session. Thank you very much, Joel, for willingness to present in Chol HaMoed. Chag Sameach to all of you. I will just say that Joel is one of the senior comparative scholar, comparative politics scholar, maybe international studies. He might want to correct me the way he presents himself, but his work on his book on strong state, weak societies, capacities of third world countries is one of the most cited and most read book in the literature. About 5,000 citations, or maybe even more in Google Scholar. So he's influential. He's now made Aliyah and lives in Israel. He's an emeritus and is part of the Hebrew University. And thank you so much, Joel, for joining us. And please go on. You can lead the chat now, the discussion now.
Okay, so first of all, I'm very happy to be here. And if we weren't such a big group, I would ask you to introduce yourselves and tell me what you're working on. But I think that would take the entire time. So whenever I've given this talk before, I've done it in a small group and it's been interactive. So I still urge you to write questions you have on the chat page, and I will stop every once in a while and look them over and see if there's something to respond to. And also, occasionally, I'll try to remember just to stop, and if you have a question, unmute yourself, and you can ask the question out loud. So I'd like to have it as interactive as possible. Okay, so writing and publishing, I call them acts of persuasion. זאת אומרת, אתם רוצים להשפיע על מישהו או משהו. You write because you believe that the way people are doing or thinking about the things that you're thinking about are wrong, or they're incomplete, or they're inadequate. And if you don't believe that, there's no reason for you to write. So you're trying to persuade people to see things differently. You write because you believe the way things have been done up until now are wrong, and you are going to correct them. So the first question you want to ask yourself when you're writing is, whom are you trying to persuade? And to put that question a little differently, who is your audience? Every writer has to think carefully about whom they're trying to reach, who the audience is, who they're trying to persuade. Is it a broad audience? Is it an interdisciplinary audience? Is it a narrow audience of people dealing with a very highly specialized topic? And for each of those categories, you would have different language that you would use, more specialized language, jargon of the field, more broad language that is perhaps a little more imprecise, but will still enable you to reach a larger audience. And so you want to think about, when you're writing, your voice. What is my voice? How am I conveying myself in a way that is going to reach my audience in the most effective way, make me the most persuasive that I can possibly be? And each voice that you use is appropriate to the audience. So you're thinking interactively when you write. And I had one teacher, Michael Walzer, who was a political philosopher. He is a political philosopher. And the way he wrote, he said, was to imagine Rousseau and Montesquieu and Hobbes and Locke sitting around the table. And he would write, and he'd look up and ask Rousseau, is this okay? Does this make sense to you? And you have to also imagine your audience and imagine it's making sense for them. Too many people write for themselves without a clear idea of what their audience is. So that's the first question, whom you're writing for. The second question is, how do I find my audience? How do I go beyond the imaginary people sitting around the table? Because writing a paper, publishing a paper, does not guarantee you an audience by any means. There's a proliferation of journals today. No one in the world can keep up with the journals, even in their very narrow field and with the numbers of articles. So people have to make choices and find means to choose what they're going to read. And that's very true in all the professional literature and academics. And so there are three principal ways that scholars, older scholars, real old people like David, decide what to read. Number one, they know someone personally. And so, oh yeah, I know so-and-so, I met him, I know his work, that work I find interesting, I see there's an article by him, I'm going to read it. The second way that people like David make a choice is by reputation. That is, they see a name. It's not someone they know personally necessarily, but they know the name. They know that this person is a leading person in the field, is at the center of what's going on in that field, and they say, oh, yeah, there's an article I should read. If so-and-so in my field, if Samuel Huntington writes an article, I would read it because he's an important person. And the third way, and probably the most popular way that we read articles, is someone recommends the article to us. That is, they say to us, you know, I read something really interesting that I think you'd be interested in given the nature of your work. And you say, yeah, send me the reference. I want to see that. So personal references are critical. Now, for newcomers in the field, which applies to, I think, almost all of you sitting out there today, for newcomers in the field, almost none of these methods works, right? You don't have a reputation yet, I'm sorry to say. People are not going to recommend your paper very much because you have a very narrow circle at this point. And it's only if someone happens to know you personally, and again, the narrowness of your circle, of the people you know, of the people you work with, really limits the degree to which someone is going to pick up your paper or recommend your paper to someone else. So it's very, very hard to establish a reputation in the field to have your paper read. So what you need to do is to create your audience. You have to construct the audience, and that's what I'm going to talk about from here on in. Let me stop for a second and ask if you have any questions up until this point. You can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you later talk about what makes an article more usable when they tend to quote it or not?
Yeah.
Because it's quite it's hard to publish, but many times people publish articles and then they are not quoted at all, or
Right.
they are very quoted, or they are not quoted at all. So if you can, I don't know in what time it will be appropriate for you, but if you can also discuss about it later.
I will towards the end.
Okay.
Okay.
Another question, if
Yes.
possible, related to what was just asked, the politics of writing an article.
I couldn't quite hear the question, but I think it was what are the politics of publishing and placing an article? Is that
Yes,
more or less?
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Name dropping, citing other big works.
I didn't hear the last thing you said.
Citing
Yeah.
other big names, big works, make our article, paper more relatable, more relevant.
Okay. Yeah. I'll address those towards the end. So let me go on if there are no other questions at this point. So the key to creating an audience is reciprocity, hadadiyut, or yachasei gomlin. And what does reciprocity mean, and how does it work? The simple meaning is you read someone else's work, and they, in turn, will read yours. The bigger question is, how do you achieve this? How do you get people to read your work and to engage in a reciprocal relationship with you? And the way I conceive it is that there are a series of concentric circles, right? Ma'agalim concentri. First, you start inside your own academic department. Almost everyone in every field should be part of a writing group of PhD students or postdocs in your field. A writing group can consist of as few as 3 or as many as 7 or 8 people. It shouldn't be more than that. And it's a simple procedure in which you get together and you present the unfinished work that you have, not the final drafts, but drafts before that are presentable but not yet finished, and you present it to each other. I don't know, we could take, if we had clickers, we could see how many of you are in writing groups now. If you're not in a writing group, you should be. It is the best way to start building an audience, to getting really substantive feedback on what you're writing, and we'll begin to answer some of the questions that you've already asked, and I'll address later. How is the article relevant? Is it really meaningful to people who are not doing exactly the kind of work you're doing, but are close? So you want to try and develop within your departments a writing group of students and even perhaps young postdocs and faculty. Then the second circle in this concentric configuration is your faculty. Now, this is a complicated business because faculty are always busy and it's hard to get them to read your work, right? There are 2 kinds of faculty, I always say to students. There are faculty who make you know that they are very busy, and there are faculty who are very busy but don't let you know that they're very busy. I prefer the second kind, but in either case, they are busy and it's difficult for them to find the time to read your papers. What do you do? Well, I think there are a couple of things you can do. Number 1, you start by reading a recent paper of theirs before you come into this. I'm not talking necessarily about your supervisor, your manche. I'm talking about broader faculty in your department. Read a paper of theirs and come into their office, make an appointment or come into their office hours and say, I read your paper. I found it very interesting. Always tell them how great it is. I'll come back to that later. And it relates in a way to what I do. And I'm wondering if you might also read something of mine. And so you're again establishing a kind of reciprocity, a reciprocal relationship in which it's very hard for a faculty, after you've come and read her paper and commented on that paper and made some interesting, had some interesting insights, it's very hard for them to say no. Once you ask them and they say yes, that doesn't mean they're going to read it. In fact, usually they put it in a pile and don't read it. And so what you have to do is nag, okay, not nid. And the simplest way to do that, I mean, without making yourself obnoxious, is to write an email and saying, I know you're busy. I hope you had a chance to read my paper. Could I come in to talk to you about it? Could I make an appointment? And you make the appointment, and they will read it an hour before you come in for that appointment. It's only by shaming them in that way, showing up, that they actually read the paper. So it's important to get reciprocity with faculty. It's a little difficult to get them to respond. The third circle goes beyond your department, and it's interdisciplinary groups inside the university. Whatever you're working on, and it doesn't matter whether you're in the natural sciences or social sciences or humanities, there are people working outside your departments, usually harder to get to know, obviously, because they're not in your departments, who are working on things that are related to what you're doing and are interesting for you. It's important to get them to read your work. It's important because it allows you to establish a voice to a much broader community than simply the few people who are working specifically on your topic in your discipline. And again, you want to do the same thing. You want to use your professors, use other students to find out who those other people, both students and faculty, are in the university, and use the same techniques with them. Read a paper of theirs, or ask them to send you a paper, comment on it, give them some insights, and say, how would you like to read something of mine? I think you would gain by it. I think it's related to what you're doing. Let me stop for a second here. And Hila asks, what about using colleagues instead of a writing group? Each paper can interest different people I know, or they have other expertise. I think colleagues are great. I think that's exactly what you should do. I think they're not mutually exclusive, a writing group and colleagues. A writing group is more intense and more committed than colleagues might be. And so it's important to set up a writing group, but I think that you absolutely want to find colleagues who are doing more or less what you're doing, or dimensions of what you're doing, and setting up binary relationships. The third thing that you might do, the third circle beyond your own department and interdisciplinary groups, is cross-university groups, especially here in Israel. There are people working in universities other than your own who are doing things that are related. It's important to find out about them. Your supervisors will be I'm going to come back to the role of the supervisor later, but your supervisors can be very, very useful in finding out from their colleagues who might be working on topics related to your work in other universities here in the university, and in Israel, and you want to make contact with them, and you want to use the same kind of technique that you used with others, of asking to see their work, being willing to comment on it, and then having them read your work. And finally, there is what I call cold calling big names in your field. Now, cold calling, you know what cold calling is? It's an idiom, and it means calling someone whom you have no relationship with at all in the past. Let me just turn to Libby's question. Does sharing with other departments happen before the paper is published in the draft stage? Yeah, it should happen in the draft stage. It's a kind of delicate thing. You don't want to put something out there that is so raw that it reflects poorly on you, and yet you want to get useful comments for what the final publication will be. So it's a kind of intermediate stage in which you're sending your paper. So cold calling is pniat metzach. That I didn't know. So I'm learning something here too. That's good.
זה לא מדויק.
לא מדויק.
זה לפנות לאנשים זרים שאנחנו לא מכירים. זה כמו במרקטינג או בשיווק טלפוני, שאנחנו מתקשרים ללידים, לקוחות שבעצם הם פוטנציאליים, אבל אנחנו עוד לא מכירים אותם.
אוקיי.
זה לא אומר
זה בעצם cold calling, כן? או בעזות מצח. אוקיי.
בדיוק.
אוקיי, יופי. So, can you tell us a bit more about how the reading group works? Do we read out loud our papers? Okay, so no. The way that first of all, the reading groups will, you have to have the reading group, you have to have somebody have a paper ready to present, and it's only one paper at a time, each time you meet. Somebody's paper or chapter of your dissertation, often it's a chapter of the dissertation. And no, don't read the paper out loud. It's not a formal presentation the way a seminar is. People should have the chapter in advance and should have read it in advance. What the person presenting will do is give a little background of, here's the wider context of this chapter that you haven't read. Here's what the whole dissertation about is, if this is a chapter of the dissertation. Here's what I was trying to achieve. Here is what I was wanted to persuade people of. How did I do? And take maybe 10 minutes for the person to present and give the context for the paper, and then let people start going into the paper. And just an aside, you always have to be nice when you do this, okay? When you're critiquing other people's papers, you must be nice. What do I mean by being nice? It means realizing how much work and personal ego people put into the paper that they are giving you to read. So you want to start always with the positive and recognize how much they put into it, and then say, here's what I think might help it as you go to the next draft, rather than, firing off criticisms without stop. Okay, so I'll get back to pniyat metzach or azut metzach, cold calling. A student of mine, for those of you in the social sciences will know this name, a student of mine, Ahmed Kuru, well-known, now he's well-known in writing on religion and the state. When he was a student, sent a paper of his to Charles Tilly. Charles Tilly was one of the biggest names in sociology and in the social sciences generally. And interestingly, that Charles Tilly read the paper and in a day came back to Ahmed with all kinds of comments. That's not typical. What is more typical is that they don't answer at all. Okay, they don't answer. There's nothing you can do about that. Some people are more generous than others. Some people are better than others at this. But it's worth trying to know who the big names in your field are, the people who really sort of have defined what the area or topic that you are writing in, and to say, you know what, I'm so respectful of your work. I think I'm relating to it in an interesting way. I wonder if you might read my paper. Now, to do that, again, I would use the same technique that you used with the faculty in your own department, which is to say, I read your recent paper. Here are some thoughts I had on it, insights, comments, whatever you want, and then include what you want them to read. I would start with a short piece, something like 10 pages, an excerpt. Don't send them a whole dissertation. They won't read it. Even an entire paper, often they won't read. But if you can really pick out an excerpt of 10, 12 pages that really encapsulates what you're trying to say, they may do that, okay? And, or you can just turn to them and say, may I send you a paper? When people send to me, I often say, can you send me something around 10 pages? I'd be glad to look at it. I can't read your whole dissertation. This is an opening. All these are opening, by the way, but this in particular is an opening. It's not something you want to have one and finished. It's something you want to have as a continuing relationship where You thank the person for if they've given you some comments. You then say, I'd love to comment on more of your papers. And in fact, I read another paper. Here are some more comments. And then get back to them. They'll remember who you are. Once this is establishing an email relationship with someone halfway across the world. I've established relationship with students in Pakistan, in Egypt, in all sorts of places I would have never imagined by their simply cold calling me. Okay, so Hila also asks here, could you say something about using preprints, ResearchGate, there's also academia, Twitter to do that. I don't do it. I don't know, David, do you use those very much?
Can you repeat your question?
It's in the chat. Could you say something about using ResearchGate or academia or one of those Twitter to kind of send out your paper?
I would upload the paper as soon as it's presentable as a working paper. For my own field of study, we created the international listserv with 2,000 people or more, and we exchange ideas there. But I would say you should create your own network and use it as a way to get feedback, to get known each other and so on. And if your field doesn't have a network, build a network on around yourself, around ideas, around the issues. Be entrepreneurial. תהיה יזמי, I would say.
Yeah, I agree. Yitzhak asks, isn't these inner circles are small and they're narrow, time-consuming, and there are digital platforms where you can get a larger audience? Well, all right, let me say something about this. It's a good question. You are going to build a network of academics through your career. The small network that you start with in graduate school is really, really important. I can't tell you how many times I have received an email from someone I knew in graduate school who then asks for a favor, asks for, would I consider for a postdoc a student of hers? There are all kinds of relationships that you can't get off impersonal digital networks. The digital networks are important. I'm not saying they're not, but the very intense personal networks that you create first in graduate school, then often as a postdoc and then in your own faculty are extraordinarily important for you. For all kinds of things, for finding out information about fellowships, for finding information about jobs, for getting feedback on your writing, and so on. So I don't think that the time-consuming element here is a negative. I think it's something you're investing in that's extremely important. It's important also to build as much as you can a broader and global audience, and that's what I'm talking about now, and I'm going to talk more about in a moment. But that intense personal audience is very important. Now, again, the people are asking, what kind of paper do I send? And it's a really good question because it's not the same to everyone. If you're sending to someone really important in the field, I would say the paper doesn't have to be a finished paper, but it has to be pretty polished. It's one where you want it to be easy for them to read. It's edited, especially when you're writing in a language that's not your native language. For most of you, that means writing in English, even though you're not native English speakers. You want it edited by an English editor. I know that's costly, but it's very important if you're sending to someone important in the field. or if you're sending eventually to a journal, that's really, really important. To your personal working group, your writing group in your own department, it can be a little less polished, right? I don't have the conclusion yet, I don't have the introduction, but here's something I want to present. You can do that, but you don't want to do that with someone you don't know at all. Because they're making an impression. They're gaining an impression of you, and that impression is very, very important. Let me just look at another question.
May I intervene, Joel?
Please.
I'm sorry, I mistyped. So my sense about it, and I want you to go back to your schedule and your plan of lecture, is just to say that you don't send a cold play or the paper as is. You start building a relations, and starts with, you know, I'm working on that, I have excellent ideas. Or, I read your paper, it's excellent, I love it. Did you think about how to develop it in this way or that way? You start, you don't go, you don't offer marriage, you know, you don't propose on the first date, yeah? So build the relations, so eventually you can get feedback on your paper, create relation for the postdoc, for the recommendation, for conference invitation, for workshop invitation, and then send the paper together. Maybe he or she will send you the paper even before, and this way there is reciprocal relation work. But I'd like you to go back to your plan on how to build an audience.
I will. And I just want to say I agree with you completely. And just want to say a personal word here. I'm retired now, so I'm on the other end of my career from you, and from all of you. And I've had about a lot of PhD students that I supervise, maybe 40 over the years. But I also have about 15 people who started the relationship just in the way that David said, starting a personal relationship with me. They were not students in my university. They were scattered around the world, in Norway, in Germany, in Egypt. And these people have kept contact with me all the while. And part of their success was in courting me, in, like David said, creating a marriage. All right, let me get back to my point here. Perhaps the most important way of all to build an audience, to find people to read what you're doing, is through conferences. Conferences are more effective than digital platforms. Again, because they have the personal element. Now, why would one go to a conference at all? Well, first of all, to learn about your field, what's happening in the field, how's it changing, what are the new papers talking about, is there a kind of shift in the field? But more important for you is to test your work and your ideas, to present your dissertation chapters or papers that you're writing for your dissertation. And these can be, again, these are not drafts that have to be so polished that they're ready to publish. In fact, they shouldn't be. You're going there to get some feedback. You want them polished enough so that they make sense and you feel that the ideas are original and are good, but they may not be fully organized yet. They may have holes in them and gaps, and that's okay. You're there to get feedback on your papers. More important than presenting your paper is establishing personal contacts and creating a network in these conferences. If I had shy students, and some of my students were shy, I would say to them, okay, you're going to a conference. I want you to come back to me after the conference with 5 emails of people you talked personally to there who will exchange papers with you. This was an assignment to them because I didn't think they would do it on their own. But that's exactly what you want to do, is you want to find people in those conferences who are going to become your audience, who are going to be reading your paper, recommending your paper to other people, sending it out to others. And the way you're doing that, again, is first of all, you want to pick very carefully. You have to prepare before a conference. Prepare the panels that you want to go to that you're not presenting in. Too often, and Israelis are particularly guilty of this, they go to a conference and only go to the panel where they're presenting a paper. Don't do that. That's bad. What you want to do is find the panels that have dimensions or papers, aspects that are interesting for you, your work. What you go and you listen, and then the critical time is not the listening time during the panel itself. It's the 15 minutes after the panel ends. It's then that you want to pick out whom you're going to approach, who you're going to talk to, whether it's another graduate student or a faculty member who's presenting, it doesn't matter. You're going to go up to them and you're going to introduce yourself, and you're going to say the nicest things about their paper again. You can never flatter people in academia too much. They always think that you're just recognizing their brilliance, right? They don't think that you're being insincere. And so you tell them how great their paper was, how interesting and how important it was for your work. You then may say, I have a couple of comments I'd like to give you. If it's a graduate student that you're talking to, and you should look for other graduate students, peers, you then make a coffee date at the conference, right? Say, how about if we have coffee? Is there a time that you're free during the conference? It's these times outside the panels that are extremely important in creating your audience. If it's a professor, it's less easy to get them to give time for coffee with you because they already have their networks. And so usually before people go to a conference, they book up with their friends for coffee, for lunch, for dinner, and they don't have much time. So the key with them is to say, I loved your paper. It was wonderful. I'm working on some things that I think you would find very interesting. Could I send you some comments on what you wrote today? And perhaps you would look at my paper. Almost always they're going to say yes. It's not like cold calling, that we talked about before, where you're simply writing an email to someone who's never seen you before. You're standing in front of that person, and the personal relationship and tie that you have, even for 5 or 10 minutes after the panel ends, is very important in establishing a personal bond, which makes the person feel more tied to you and to engage in reciprocity with you. So it's really, really important. You want to establish personal context, and conferences can do that. Now, all fields are separated into subfields and subparts and smaller sections and so on. What you want to do is try and figure out, first of all, is there anything directly in your field, panels and people that you want to meet that are really important for your field, and are there people who are obliquely important? By obliquely, I mean bilti yashir, right? It's something that they're doing that is interesting to you, but is not directly in your in the middle of what you're doing. So for conferences, prepare. That's really important. Look at the preliminary program. Check off the panels you want. Look for the topics that you intersect with others. Make sure you have a list of the people you want to meet, and make contact with them as early as you possibly can. If these are important people, that by important people I mean already have established a reputation in the field, read their work beforehand. Before you get to the conference, read other papers of theirs and tell them how much you love those papers and how helpful those papers were to you and how your work really intersects with theirs in important ways. They want to hear that. Believe me, they want to hear that. And then what you want to do is make arrangements for exchanging papers over email. You're looking for both mentors in those conferences and peers. In other words, you're looking for leaders in the field and other people of your cohort who will eventually become the network that you're engaging in, the principal audience for you. Many of these conferences have working groups. Some of those are digital, the way David was mentioning before. Some are just interpersonal. See if you can join some of those working groups or even set up a working group. If you see 3, 4 people, suggest those 3, 4 people have dinner together and maybe set up a permanent working group where you're sending papers to each other and doing it over the internet. So my main suggestion is to use the after hours of the conference very wisely. Don't parachute into a conference without preparation, and don't simply go to your panel or 1 or 2 other panels and then leave. You want to use the entire time of that conference to help create your audience. So what kinds of conferences do you go to? First of all, there are the full disciplinary conferences, the American Political Science Association, the Sociological Association. I'm sure all the other fields you're in have these huge, massive conferences internationally. Those are good. They're a little more difficult to make your way in. They're intimidating, but you can get a very broad sampling in them of people who would relate to your kind of work, and that's important. But smaller conferences and workshops that you can get invited to, and you can ask to be invited to workshops if you hear of one, they're very important because there you can get people who are directly in your field. Don't go to any small conference, but a small conference or workshop that is related to the kind of work you do. And often these have travel funds available for them. The big associations have travel funds internationally. See if you can find out about those. Now, the last thing that I'm going to say before turning to a couple of questions that you raised earlier was the role of your supervisor. Now, I think you had a session already on supervisors. Some of you, let me say a word about supervisors. So to get the right supervisor is very, very important. And I would echo what David said before, that getting a supervisor is a courtship. It's like, you don't start by saying, will you marry me? I've had students walk into my office and say, I've never seen them before, and they say, would you be my supervisor? And I said, no, I don't know you. I don't know your work. You don't know my work. You haven't been in my class. I don't know anything about you. I don't know if this is a good marriage. So you want to be very, very, many of you have your supervisors already, so this is superfluous, but for those of you who don't, it's important to go into the office hours of the person, introduce yourself, try to take a course or 2 with that person, let that person see your written work either in the course or something that you give them separately. And then after a few months, you say, you know, your work is related to mine. I think I would really benefit from you. I would also do a background check on the supervisor. I think the Shabak can help you with this. That's a joke. But I seriously, you want to see if that person has supervised people before. Has that person then go talk to the people who he's supervised? Has this person, has the supervisor been accessible? Does he give you the time of day? Does he give you good comments? Does she really take your work seriously? So these are all important things. You don't want someone who's not, even they may be directly in your field and the person who on paper seems most relevant to what you're doing. You want to make sure that the person is a good person as a mentor, not only have the field that you want. This is really important. Now, one of the dimensions that you're looking for in a supervisor is that person is your advocate. Did we lose me here? Am I still here? Okay, hold on.
You are on, you are fine.
Okay, good, okay. My screen went off for a second. Your supervisor is your advocate. When a supervisor goes to a conference and meets someone, that the supervisor should be saying, oh, my student Irit is writing just on what you're doing. How about if I put her in touch with you? Okay, this is a very important role for a supervisor. And by the way, you can say that to your supervisor in a nice way, of course, that you're going to such and such a conference. If you see anybody who you think might be interesting for me, would you mention my name and perhaps get an email for me to establish a relationship, create an online introduction. So in this way, the supervisor helps you in creating your audience, the broader audience. An audience starts small and it broadens through time. And this is really very important.
Can I add something, Joel?
Please.
So let me also put myself in the spotlight video. Okay, so you already have a supervisor. You do have a supervisor, but in our world, as long as you go, as you develop, you find yourself that you have 2 and 3 and 4 supervisors. And really the supervisors are becoming mentors. So the process of building your network is also a process of building your mentors and supervisors. You have to go beyond 1 person or 2 person to have many people who can help you in advice, support, recommendation, all the way along. So everything Joel said so far about nurturing and developing your relation with the supervisor is broader. Find more mentors as you go, because you will need them for recommendations, for advice, for tips, and so on. So you don't have 1 person to rely on, build your network. This is a risk strategy, it's empowerment strategy, and both can take you forward. That's all.
Good. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of questions. Let me start with a couple of questions that you asked in the beginning, and then let me turn to the chats, and also if you have other questions, we'll leave some time for that. So David asked, what makes an article readable, or what lends itself, what in an article lends itself to building an audience? And here, it's actually a whole other lecture I could give sometime, David, on how you build a paper, how you build a dissertation. But I would say this: it has to be clear within the first page of what you write what question you are trying to ask, what you're trying to answer, that is. What is the question? What is it that you're trying to persuade them of, right? And if this is not, and this, by the way, this is not this is not only true of writing a paper, it's true of writing a proposal for a grant, or other venues as well. I know that I was a reader on many grant proposals over my career. And if I didn't know by the end of the first page what that person was trying to do, I got bored and I would say, no, this is not good. And the same with a paper. The paper, what you're trying to do in English, there's the, maybe you can write on the chat what the right word in Hebrew is. You want a hook. A hook means that you are grabbing the person's attention and riveting. Oh, that's really interesting. And usually it has to do with some kind of, as I tell my students, the world is a very bizarre place. It's a very strange place. And what you want to do is highlight the strangeness, whether it's in the physical world and you're in the natural sciences, or it's the social world. You want to highlight what is strange here that needs explaining. Why? And you want the person to say, oh, that's interesting. I really wonder what the answer to that question is, right? I used to, with my own students, I would call it my mother's question. My mother never graduated high school. And every day she would call and I would ask her, and she would ask me, what did you do today? And I would say, I spoke to a student. What's he working on? And I would say the question. If she could understand the question and it was intriguing to her, the student was a success. And if not, the student wasn't a success. Use your spouses, use your parents, make sure that your question has a hook to it that is going to grab someone. And then the job is to show two things in the paper. One is, other people have asked this question, right? And you're not the first one to ask this question. What do they say about it and why are they wrong? If they're not wrong, there's no reason for you to write the paper. But they have to be wrong. What is wrong with the existing explanations? And then give your answer, your argument, what you're trying to persuade them of. So those are the kinds of papers that tend to grab people and to tend to be more cited and more central to the field. Someone asked about the politics of an article. I'm not quite sure what the politics of an article is. Maybe I'm an idealist, but I think there are no politics to getting articles published in journals. I think most journals are really fair in the sense of that they are using the double-blind method and they don't know who the article is from. I do think that you want, again, to try and address the question, even if your question is narrowly based, you want to address the broader question in the field. Why is this of interest to others besides the 3 or 4 of us working on this very narrow issue? What is the broader context of the issue? Why is it important what I'm saying? And I think those are the articles that tend to be cited. Those are the articles that tend to have some influence. Now, let me go to the chats, and then if you think of some questions for presenting orally. How effective would you say presenting a poster in a conference is? Posters are less useful than presenting papers, but sometimes, especially in these big conferences, it's very hard to get a paper accepted. A poster is good because it tends to attract people who are doing precisely what you're doing. It's not very good in getting a broader audience because they're just going to walk by your poster. But it is good in finding the 1 or 2 people, 3 people maybe, who are doing the kinds of things you're doing and establishing a relationship with them and having a time to talk to them on a one-on-one basis. So I'd say posters are good, but they're limited. So it's still not clear to me, Libby writes, how these correspondences translate to citations. I would not obsess about citations. That's not what you're aiming for in this stage of your career. The citations will come. The key now is getting readers. Once you get readers, the citations will follow. They're going to start citing your work in their own papers. I would not get obsessed with citations. I would be obsessed with establishing as broad a network of readers with whom you have a reciprocal relationship as possible. Can you give an example how you build an audience to one of your earlier papers? And how did it feel to that moment? Okay, so I don't know if I could do that, but I will say this. I started my career actually in Israel. My very first job was at Tel Aviv University, very long time ago. And then I went to the United States and taught after that in two other universities at Harvard and University of Washington. In being in Israel, it was much harder to get noticed than being certainly at Harvard and at the University of Washington. Israel is the periphery of the academic world. It's on the periphery of the academic world, and you have to work harder to become part of a global intellectual and academic audience. And so the first paper I wrote was one that was published in a pretty well-known journal, World Politics. And I sent it to everyone after it was published. Anybody I could think of, I sent to him. And what we do have in Israel is a lot of visitors from the academic world in Europe and the United States. And I tried to corner them when they came to Tel Aviv University and to give them my paper. And that paper did, have some influence, and it felt good. And you know what? It still feels good when someone cites your paper. Let's see. How legit is it to ask a lecturer to include your paper in your syllabus? And that's a really good question. And I would say this. You don't have enough money to hire a publicist, a public relations person. So guess who's going to be your public relations person? You. You must, you have to be a little bit of a chutzpan in an academic career. You want to make sure that your paper is getting to the right eyes. I think it's the most important is if you can get it onto a syllabus in graduate schools, because then you're influencing the up and coming generation. And so I think it's perfectly legitimate to say to someone, well, I read your syllabus, and syllabi are online. They're easy to get. I read your syllabus. I wonder if you might consider my paper. I think it actually might be interesting for your students, and send the paper. I think it's perfectly legitimate to do that. Can you expand on writing for a designated audience, especially when our field is multidisciplinary? How to choose the most appropriate audience or the journal? Yeah, so this is a very good question. Most of my graduate students were in political science, but a number of my graduate students were in multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary PhD programs. And it is a little harder for them to find their audience. You have to work a little harder at it. But there are two sorts of I guess I'm not sure this applies to everyone listening today, but you have the substantive element of what you're dealing with, right? The theoretical idea at the core of your work. and you want to find journals and people who are thinking about that, even though it may be very different from you. They may be thinking about China and you're thinking about Ghana. But the theoretical question, the substantive question, is very similar. So you want to find them, and the journals that they will read will not be the journals about Ghana. They are going to read journals that are more substantively and theoretically oriented. On the other hand, you want to also get the people who are working on Ghana, because that's what you're working on. And so you want to look for two sorts of journals. One that is what in my field would be area focused, and another substantively focused. So, and the same is with finding your audience in the ways I talked about. You want to look for people in both fields. And especially, it seems to me, for those of you working you know, on very specific sorts of questions in your field, you, again, this is going back to what we said earlier, you want to find the people who have defined the nature of the field, the leaders of the field, and you want to be able to address them in a way that says to them, I think I have, through my particular specific study, have something to say about the broader area. Okay, let's see. Have I used mass media for building audiences for academic work? So, you know, I'm a little too old for this. I did not use social media. I built a website and I thought I was going to do it, but it was already at the end of my career, and I had to, I think, depend much more on the network that I had built through my career. So I am not very helpful on that. Let's see. Yeah, someone writes that the hook idea is especially important for conferences, and I think that's right. You can really bore people in conferences. You want to have that hook early, and you want it to be, let me just say no, okay. You want it to be, you want that hook to be verbally, I don't like reading papers. You want it to be verbally very clear. Here's what's interesting here. Here's what we don't understand. Here's the context of which I'm putting my study, and here's the question I'm going to answer. You want to put that in the first 2 minutes of your conference presentation. I think it's really, really critical to do that. I think also you want to be very careful to rehearse your presentation. If you have 15 minutes, don't go on for 25 minutes and the person is handing you papers, your time is up, you have 2 minutes left. It's very distracting. It's very hard for you, especially, I know it's difficult, particularly when conferences are in English. When English is not your native language, to present a paper without reading it. But I would still suggest that you practice and do that. Look, engage, get eye contact with your audience, and make sure you get the hook for them. Let's see, Maya writes, so basically you mean write to read, in the way that you write your paper as if you're about to read it. Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think I try to adopt, I'm going to say something about Hebrew here in a second. I try to adopt a language that is conversational in my papers. Now, it's easier to do that in English than in Hebrew, because Hebrew has more of a separation between literary Hebrew, even Hebrew that's used in the newspapers, and spoken Hebrew. Whereas English used to have that, but it's really, that gap has disappeared, and written and spoken English are almost identical. So I do try in my written work to be as approachable and accessible as possible in the language I use. Daphna asks, can you share with us any advice on making a connection with a relevant industry? If you are writing something that could be relevant for private companies in a certain area or government ministries. This is hard. This is hard to do. It's hard to do for a number of reasons. Partly because these people often aren't used to reading academic papers. I know people who have done it. They have made these contacts. The key, the normal business memo is 3 pages long. If you're going to send a 25-page or 30-page paper, it generally will not get read. That's true in ministries, government ministries as well. Maybe David could say more about this, but if you can give a précis of 3 to 5 pages, you're much more likely to have that read and then for them to take notice. And then once you have a relationship with them, it would be somewhat different. What do you think, David?
I'll take your kind of issue and take it to my experience as a journal editor for 15 years already. I know I have a good feeling about the paper from the abstract. If the abstract is very good, it's likely that the paper is very good. And and why the abstract or why the synopsis is because you know how to deliver in a very succinct way your main ideas. So 250 words of an abstract when the paper is coming to my kind of editorial decision, should I send it out or not? I you know, pay a lot of attention to the abstract, the introduction, the conclusion. This is a bit about how to publish your paper, but it's to find your audience. You need to know how not only the hook, but how to deliver your ideas very succinctly and very clear way. I'm not sure I answered your question, Joel, or
yeah.
But I trust you on that.
Let me go on with some of these questions. Could you please elaborate a bit on developing an academic career in an interdisciplinary field? Yeah, so I don't know if all interdisciplinary fields are the same in this, but for the interdisciplinary fields where I had students, I tried to make sure that they could claim a discipline, okay? They could claim themselves as sociologists or political scientists or anthropologists. And the reason I insisted on that is because even though universities pay a lot of lip service to interdisciplinarity, the truth is they are still structured mostly along disciplinary lines. That's where the jobs are. And so my interdisciplinary students did get jobs, all of them got jobs, but they got jobs mostly in disciplinary departments where they could claim they could be a disciplinary and have the advantage of knowing a lot about other disciplines and using those other disciplines and bringing them into the discipline. They use that as a positive, as a strength in their job interviews. The elevator pitch. Yeah, this is really, does everybody know what an elevator pitch is? How about someone writing in Hebrew what that is? I don't know. Tamtzit. Everybody, how's it? Malit? Okay. All right. Every academic, and that includes all of you, needs 3 pitches or 3 descriptions of your work. The 30-second description, the 5-minute description, and the 30-minute description. And it's very, very important for you to learn when to use which of those three. You don't want to use the 30-minute on somebody who wants only 30 seconds, okay? It's very important to be able to discern socially what pitch you use, but you have to have all three of them ready. I'll give an example from the very early part of my career when I was just had finished graduate school. I met one of the famous political scientists of the 20th century, Harold Lasswell. And Harold Lasswell said to me, what are you working on? And I had to make a decision right then. I had him at lunch, so I decided the 30-second was too short. The 30-minute would be too boring, so I gave him the 5-minute. It was interesting. He wanted the 30-minute, actually, but that was fine. He took the 30-minute and then began to tell me, or ask me questions and to tell me what I should be reading and what I should be doing with this work. It was one of the best conversations I ever had. It's very important. The same is true orally and in writing. The abstract is the 30-second pitch. It's what David is talking about. The 250 words is your 30-second pitch. You must have the hook in there. You must have the context of what you're asking and why it's important that you're asking it, and then what your a brief account of what your argument is, what your answer to the question is, what your contribution here is. So, okay, let's see. My name is Iris Cohen. Hello, Iris. Oh, there's a private note. Okay. What is a good abstract? Maybe I'll turn that over to David to answer that question.
I wrote something in the text, and I also will send the leaflet on what is a good abstract for social science abstract. So I'm returning the discussion to you.
Okay, so would it be out of place or naive for a PhD student to comment on the work of a leading researcher in the field? No, it is not out of place. It has to be done, like I said before, extremely respectfully. You're really saying the positive things, and then you're saying, this is so important to me. It's raising questions in my mind. And you then pose some of those questions. It is absolute, there is, well, how should I put this? There is a clear hierarchy that you've encountered in academia. And at the other hand, there's a clear equality. And the equality comes in the presentation of ideas. Don't be afraid to assert your ideas, to say where you think you're making a contribution. I think that's really, really important. So I'm happy to take some oral questions if you have any.
How much time do you spend corresponding with other researchers, creating and maintaining your network? How much time do you spend in reading other people's work that is not, that you know that is not specifically related to your work, but you're doing it because it's important to maintain this network, these connections?
It's a wonderful question. And I'm gonna sound like a complainer. As you proceed through your career, it gets to be more and more and more. And at this point, sometimes I feel I am doing nothing but reading other people's work and writing letters of recommendation. This has become my career now. So it is a lot, and it's time consuming. It's also extremely enriching. And I, even though I'm a political scientist, I taught in an interdisciplinary center, a school of international studies. I felt I learned so much in reading the papers of people outside my field, how to approach the topic differently, how to think outside the box, how to have a different kind of approach that maybe the political scientists that I knew wouldn't have. And so Yeah, I spend a lot of time reading papers. It is time consuming, and I know all of you have jobs and dissertations to write, and it's hard, but I think it's not overwhelming in the early part of your career. It does get kind of overwhelming at this point.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question. It was very interesting. Thank you for the talk. I come from biology, from natural sciences. So the short paper that you were describing is actually a long one for me. And we usually, as a PhD student, I usually look at more at the title of a paper before I decide if I'm going to read it or not. Do you have any insights on the importance of titles later on, or even at this point?
You know, it's a funny question because I am not great at titles. And I do think, and I am often intrigued by other people's titles. The one title I thought that really worked for me was the book that David mentioned in the introduction, Strong Societies and Weak States. And that even was, I was stealing that title from a famous anthropologist named Clifford Geertz, who used the title Old Societies and New States, and I use Strong Societies and Weak States. So I think a good title is good and important. And I'm writing a book now in which I have worked endlessly on the title, and I've asked friends to help me with the title. So I think titles are important because they can grab the interest of the reader. And I don't know if it's true in your field, but in the social sciences, you often have a primary title, which is the hook, and a title after the colon, a subsidiary title, which is a subtitle, which is the kind of more explanatory. And that seems to be a good method.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about an abstract for a conference. Is it fruitful to include thoughts about complementarity of my article or aspect of work presented to the work of others, or rather focus upon the core of my own work? Is it useful to sacrifice one or two sentences to point that my work fills in a gap among, let me say, Stephen Nafziger and Jane Burbank and so on, and simply where is the complementarity aspect, the contribution in the puzzle?
Yeah, I do think that it is worth, if you have a clear deviation or complementarity or contribution that really speaks to the heart of the literature, I would say it is worth a sentence or two in an abstract. Yes.
May I add something on that?
Yeah.
One of the fun things is, for me as an editor of journal, is to play with the authors on their titles. So just before I'm accepting the paper, I'm asking them, let's think about the paper, the title of the paper. Would it be attractive for readers? Does it convey the main message, the main concept, and so on? So I think titles are very, very important in building your audience. And I will jump from titles to building your audience and the journals that you choose. So one of my suggestion usually is to choose the journal in the in the beginning of writing or in the middle of writing. Find your audience is also find your journals. So Joel spoke about area journals and general journals, kind of Ghana and the world politics, meaning much more than Ghana, theoretical journals, more theoretical journals. And I would suggest, how do you know that your choice of journal in the middle of the process is the one that is right for you, is the right audience for you? And one of the key measures, very simple, not always true, but likely to be true, is do you cite this journal? Do you cite papers, recent papers from this journal? How old is the journal? This is one question. And then recent is compared to that. So you are speaking, you're building your audience of journals, you're building the audience of your paper for a specific journal. You know that you are in the right journal when you are part of the discussion, meaning relevant papers in recent years. That's all.
Good.
Now,
I agree. There's a chat question asking, should we start constructing syllabi based on our thesis during our PhD studies? And if so, at what stage? This is a good question. Look, I happen to think for professional reasons, that means getting a job, it's very important for you to try and teach a course of your own during your PhD studies. This may take some advocacy by your supervisor. It may mean you're approaching the department chair, but to the degree that you can teach an independent course, not just be a Ozer Mechkar or a teaching assistant, you are enhancing your credentials a lot. And that gives you an opportunity to build a syllabus. I don't think most people have the time or energy to write syllabi abstractly, which are not attached to real courses. If you do, kol hakavod. But and again, a syllabus is an opportunity to build an audience. If you're teaching a course and building a syllabus and you're using an article, write the person whose article you're using. Say, I'm doing this course and I'm using your article and I really thought it would be useful for your students for such and such and you try to establish a relationship with that person if you don't know her already. So that's my advice on that. Any other questions?
So if not, we can finish here. Let me say thank you very much to Joel. I hope, Joel, that you managed to record the talk, because mine was interrupted, so I'm not sure. We will, with the consent of Joel, we will try to upload it and continue the discussion. And actually, Joel volunteered to speak about how to build your paper. Do you remember that? So we might meet him here again in a month or so. So thank you very much, Joel.
I'd be happy to. להתראות.
תודה רבה, מקרב לב.
תודה.
על כל העצות. המון המון תודה לשניכם.
תודה. And we meet
I also wanted to say thank you very much.
Yeah, we meet tomorrow at 5 with יופי תירוש, סדנה במחסומי כתיבה. להתראות.
Thank you so much. Such a great talk. Thank you.